Hey everybody, welcome back to BI 101. We're going to talk now about Alabama's biodiversity and its origins in deep time, looking at how species came to be and why there's so much variation in the Alabama landscape and in biodiversity around the world. Okay, so recall that one of the many things that we're doing with this class is trying to understand why there's so many species in Alabama. And by now you know that there's three major reasons. One is the climate that Alabama enjoys. It's very warm and it's very wet, and that's very conducive to ecological diversity in the state. And primary productivity, which is a fancy way of saying that there's lots of plants doing lots of growing in the state, and that supports lots of other species. Second reason is the evolutionary history, explaining why all these species are here in the first place. And that's what we're going to tackle today. And that is naturally interwoven with the third reason that I have here, which is geologic history of the state. And we're going to set geology aside for a little bit. We'll come back to that in a couple of lectures. Today we're going to dig into and start understanding the foundations for evolution, which is, of course, the way or how species are changing over time. To understand that, though, and why evolution works and what it's all about, we have to understand how life works on the planet in terms of how new organisms are created from their parent organisms and how that involves genes and DNA and all that sort of stuff. So by the time you're done with this, you're going to have a good introduction to that. So let's get started. But let's first acknowledge that we're going to be talking about evolution, a word that you're, depending on what school you came from, your high school and middle school biology teachers may have given you a great introduction to evolution and education on evolution, or they may have avoided it because of it being because there's controversy over it. It's not scientific controversy. It's just there are those that see evolution as an idea that is in opposition to their religious worldview of the world, and so evolution has been condemned by many in the Christian tradition and some other traditions. And yet, I think, as you'll see as we get through this unit and a couple other units, there's no reason that it could not be compatible with a religious worldview, even a Christian worldview. In fact, I have many, many friends who are Christians who are like, well, of course evolution happens. That's just the way that my God made the world work. So there's a lot to explore there, a lot to unpack there. I just want to acknowledge that some of you are probably not too comfortable with this topic, and I want you to know that you're not alone in the class. So in a normal class, I'm taping this in fall 2020 during the pandemic. We're not meeting in person, obviously. But I'm just illustrating that in a normal semester, I actually poll students anonymously and ask them what their beliefs are about evolution in order to illustrate sort of like that you're not alone in what your thoughts are. I try to do that to encourage people to talk about evolution, and we will be talking about it in our breakout group soon. So this is the question that I ask. I make the question anonymous, so I can't find out who said what. Not that I would ever do that, but people might not know that. And I say, how would you agree with this statement? Evolutionary theory is compatible with my worldview, including my spiritual, religious, and/or philosophical beliefs. You strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. I don't have enough information yet. I'm undecided. Or I have enough info, but I am still undecided. So if you're watching the video for the first time and haven't found your answer to this question, go ahead and hit the pause button. Take a moment or two to figure out what your answer is, and then pick up and restart the video in just a second. Okay, welcome back. Let's see how one of my recent classes responded to this. As you see that of the responses, the majority response was about 39% strongly agreeing and 28% agreeing. So that's about over 60, about 62 or 65% of, I'm not doing my math here right, am I? Yeah, about 65% of the class, about 2/3 of the class agreeing or strongly agreeing with the statement. However, it was, at least in this semester, there was about 14% of students disagreed or strongly disagreed. In my typical class, based on typical class size, it was probably just one student that strongly disagreed. Choice D there. I can't remember for sure. I don't remember what semester this was. And a lot more that are actually sort of undecided. They're conflicted to some degree. Typically, the situation is that you've got parents and your pastors and preachers and priests and stuff who are dismissive of evolution, maybe even telling you it's evil or something like that. And yet you've had your science classes and you're like, well, it makes sense in science class. It's just that it's in conflict with what my religious leaders or my parents or whatever are telling me. And that's a lot of these that are in these last two categories, E and F. Okay, so my point is that nobody is unique, no matter what your response is to those questions. And I encourage you in this class to reach out and ask the questions that you want to have answers to about evolution, because this is your last shot at a biology class until you graduate, and now's your time to ask a biologist about evolution. I will point out that it is not my goal to, well, I guess I'll get to that in a second. Hang on. I got another question for you. And here's that question. Do you believe other species have evolved, or were they created in their present form? The choices were evolved and done so naturally evolved, or evolved with some divine guidance, created by divine force in present form, or undecided. So I ask this question sort of get at like where the sticking points are for people in their belief systems about evolution and their worldviews. And so you might take a moment to pause here and see what your answer is, and then I'll show you what my class answered recently. Okay, coming on back here, let's see what a recent class did. Most people are like, yep, evolved naturally. So that's even more than the 65% or so that agreed or strongly agreed with that first statement. They're like, yeah, that's other species evolved and evolved naturally. That's just fine. The rest of the class, about a little less than 25% of the class, are somewhere scattered in these other categories. Okay. The next question I like to ask is this: do you believe that humans have evolved, or were they created in their present form? So not just other species, which was the focus of the previous question, but us humans. Do you think and it's the same choices here. So you might take a moment to pause and see what you think. Okay, coming back, let's see how my classes responded. And you see here, this really digs in at some of the issues about how people might have some conflicting understandings or beliefs about evolution and their religious worldviews and stuff. So whereas before we had 77% of people saying other species evolved naturally, it's down to like less than half of the class at about 46%. About 26% of the class evolved with some divine guidance, and choice C was created by a divine force in present form, or some of you are undecided. So this gets at like whether we or not and I mean everyone here, whether or not folks have like a special view of what humans are. Are we special in the world according to like how we came into existence, or did we evolve just as other species evolved? I would say that I have, like I said, many friends, and there's many very insightful and gifted theologians, etc., that say that evolution of humans is compatible with religious views. It all is based on your assumptions, frankly, about things that no one really espouses to have super great knowledge of. Even within the religious traditions, there's a lot of mystery as to the divine forces and how and why they do things. All that to say that this is one of the sticky points, is that in that people tend to balk at the idea that there's not something divinely special about humans. That's something that you might want to talk about and think about. And what does that mean to not have and share equal footing with other species in that regard, even within a religious worldview? There's lots of interesting moral and ethical things that come up with that. Okay. My goal is not to convince you of anything. If you believe in God and you are religious and all that, that's great. I respect that. I would not want to convince you otherwise. My goal is simply to make sure that all the students that come out of this class understand what science says about how species have changed through time, and that involves how new species have come into existence, and then how populations change as they adapt to a changing environment. And in my view of the world, that includes us humans. The same processes that are affecting other species, the science shows that it's affecting humans as well. We humans are still evolving. We don't talk about that in this course, but it is certainly true. And there's lots out there you can read about online. Okay. Let's now turn to the mechanics of how organisms come into being from their parents. So we're going to look at inheritance patterns. We're going to look at DNA and all this sort of stuff. We're going to start at a ground level here. What you're looking at here is a cartoon illustrating the molecular structure of the molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short. That twisted shape, it looks like a ladder, like a climbing ladder that has been twisted on one end, and so that it winds up having this sort of spiral shape to it. That's called a double helix. And all organisms on the planet use DNA, or a very similar molecule like RNA, as the basis of storing information for doing all the growth, the maintenance, and reproduction that organisms need to do. Those few that use RNA instead of DNA, those are viruses. Some viruses are RNA based, but all the things that traditionally are considered living organisms, because viruses are kind of in the in-between zone, not quite fitting our definition of life and not quite fitting our definition of not life. So of all those things that are considered definite life forms, they all have DNA. We are one ginormous genetic family on this planet, all of us living organisms. This molecule stores information. It's a way of coding information in chemical code. And that's all the information needed for development, maintenance, and reproduction. Development, what I mean by that is like growth from when sperm and egg come together to growing into a full adult. Okay, moving on here. All right, here's just another illustration of what the DNA molecule looks like, kind of simplified down so we can see some of the subcomponents of the molecule here. I want you to learn about nucleotides. Nucleotides are these light gray rungs of the ladder, so to speak, that span the spine of the DNA molecule. And there are four versions or four flavors of these nucleotides. There's adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Okay? Think about these as kind of like Legos that only match up with another Lego block that fits it perfectly. So only adenines and thymines can clip together, and only guanines and cytosines can clip together. And so as you look on the schematic here, you'll see, or on the illustration here, you'll see that only C's and G's are together and only A's and T's are together. Okay, so the nucleotides are these subunits here that clip together to form these what are called nitrogenous bases that span the backbone of the DNA, which is a sugar phosphate backbone. This strip of dark gray here is composed of sugars with phosphate molecules in there. Okay, all right. The cool thing about this is that it's this simple structure that codes all the information for making a complete you, a complete human, as well as a complete organism of any species on the planet. It's all done with just these four nucleotides. Okay? I guess that's not all that crazy now that we're in the age of computers where we use binary code to do everything we do with computers. The coding is either it's a 1 or a 0, and it's the sequence and the patterns of ones and zeros that lead to all the diversity of things that we do in computer programming to make all this wonderful technology work. Okay, moving on here. Hopefully that was a helpful analogy. Now, what I want to explain is how those nucleotides that we saw on the DNA molecule turn into the stuff of life, okay? So to begin with, I want to introduce the term amino acid. An amino acid is a molecule that is used to make proteins. Now, you're probably familiar with the word protein, certainly from paying attention to your diet. But you should know that proteins are like the main type of molecule in living organisms. So if you evaporate all the water away and ignore all the water, and you ignore all the sugars and the fats, what you're left with predominantly is proteins, okay? There's proteins in your blood, there's proteins in your brain, your muscles are made of proteins, pretty much everything's made of proteins, okay? Even the chemical messengers molecules that go through your body are proteins, okay? And the structure of the nucleotides on the DNA molecule tells the cell, the biological cell, it tells the cell how to make an amino acid. And the DNA tells the cell how to assemble the amino acids in order to make a protein. Okay, so rolling back a slide here, we go from these nucleotides, the pattern in the nucleotides, 3 of them are the right recipe for making one of these amino acids, in this case like a T, and a G along that DNA molecule spells the recipe for telling the cell how to make a leucine, which is one of the amino acids. There's a little over 20 of them that we humans need. An A, a G, and a T in sequence tells the cell to assemble all the ingredients floating around in the cell to make a serine, which is another type of amino acid. And then other chunks of the DNA say, okay, assemble the leucine with these other amino acids to make this protein, and so forth and so on. Okay, so that's why we refer to, and then the proteins are essentially the building blocks of life, most organic tissue. Okay. If you need like another explanation on this, if parts of my explanation are a little bit muddy or fuzzy to you, go online and simply look up some basics like basic DNA, like how is DNA used to make proteins. Google that and you'll get some good videos and things like that. Okay. Now in humans, there are 22 amino acids that are used in order to make all the proteins that we have in the human body. How many proteins is that? Well, we are still discovering them. There are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and each species has its own unique set. That doesn't mean that there isn't overlap. Many species will share some basic proteins, but there are proteins that each species has that are not found in other species as well. Okay, so we've gone from nucleotides to codons, and from codons to amino acids, from amino acids to proteins. That's how the DNA molecule codes for information for how to build proteins, those building blocks of life. Now, this is a picture of some genes. Looks like some toddler genes, if I'm not mistaken. That's not the kind of genes that we're talking about here, though. We're talking about the genes that are found in living organisms. And we define a gene as all the base pairs that are needed to create a protein. So in other words, going back to our DNA molecule way back here, it would be all of the base pairs, these light gray bars, that are needed along a sequence of DNA to tell a cell how to make a complete protein. Now, maybe it's just a little bit of those nucleotide base pairs if you have a simple protein to make, but many proteins are very elaborate and require very long stretches of the DNA in order to provide the right recipe to the cell for making the protein. Okay, So it can be very simple or it can be very complex. The gene, it can be simple or complex. The way all this is structured, there is an infinite number of combinations of base pairs, amino acids, and proteins. And you can just keep combining. It's like having like unlimited supply of Legos, even though you might only have like 4 Lego types, which are would be equivalent in this analogy to the nucleotides on the DNA molecule. Even though you only got those 4, you can keep assembling them in an infinite diversity of forms, which is one reason why there is such diversity of life on this planet, is that our coding for doing life, the DNA, allows for considerable diversity. Okay. Now there's limits on that diversity, and we'll get to that in the next class. But here we're learning, just understanding these basic foundations of life, understanding life. Okay, moving on here. All right. This is to illustrate where DNA is kept in our cells and also to introduce a few new terms. What you see up here at the top right, let me turn on the highlighter, laser pointer. Here we go. At this cell up at the top right, this is a representative of an animal cell. You notice the irregular shape. Don't have to know that, but just FYI. And within the cell is this circular thing. Of course, this is a sphere in reality. This is just a 2-dimensional representation of this. This inner circle here represents the nucleus of the cell. There's a term that you probably haven't heard since high school or high school biology, right? Well, it's in the nucleus that the DNA is stored, and it's stored in these chunks that we call chromosomes. Okay, so here's an example to the right, and the rest of this illustration shows you what a chromosome looks like. Now, I do want to point out that this is an illustration of chromosomes when the cell is about to reproduce, and it has made and 2 versions of the same chromosome have come together. So actually just one side of this, what looks like a funky X, is a chromosome, and then this side would be another chromosome. For a cell to reproduce, matching chromosomes must find each other in the cell nucleus and do a whole bunch of stuff that we don't have to worry about in this class, thankfully. So I do want to point out, though, that this is representing 2 chromosomes up here. Okay. Now, the DNA material, let's start down here. We've seen this double helix, right? And this double helix, in order to pack all that information into a little cell, we wind up seeing the DNA is spiraled up on itself, sort of twisted up on itself, and it's wrapped around these circular spheres that are made of proteins. They're called histones, a special type of protein. So it's like taking some thread and wrapping it around a spool. It's the same kind of thing going on here, wrapping the DNA, these long DNA molecules around the histones. And then once that's done, the histones are kind of like beads on a string, or sort of spiraled together like this in your next structure. And then that spiral is wound together to make another spiral, which is wound together to make yet another spiral. And then that's how you wind up packing so much DNA into a chromosome. Okay? Now, each chromosome is essentially a very, very, very long strand of DNA, one that would stretch out like many centimeters if you were to unravel it and stretch it out in front of you. The one thing I want you to understand is that along that long DNA molecule in that chromosome, there will be many genes. Remember, genes are the instructions for building a particular protein. Okay, so we've got this gene library in our cells. It's packaged into these chromosomes, and within the chromosomes you have the DNA. Okay, now there are 2 fundamentally different types of life forms on the planet in the way that they store their DNA. There's prokaryotes and eukaryotes. You and I are eukaryotes, as we will see. Let's first look, though, at the prokaryotes. Oh, look at that. I forgot that I had a check-in question here for you before we go into prokaryotes. This is a question to help you sort of check in to see whether you're absorbing this information. what is made by cells using the information coded by the 3 base pairs of DNA. So if you go back to the DNA molecule and you look at those 3 base pairs, what is it that is made by those cells? Made by those base pairs. What is that information for doing? What is the next step in the process of making a protein? Go ahead and pause here and see if you can figure out the answer. Okay, so hopefully you got this correct. The answer is C, amino acid. So those three nucleotides along the DNA have the information for making making an amino acid. Okay, moving on here. Come on. Computer's frozen. Hang on. Okay, here we are. Now we get to talk about prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are the simplest forms of life. So bacteria, that's something you're familiar with. Bacteria are prokaryotes. It is widely accepted that these were the first living organisms on the planet. This has to do with their simplicity. It makes sense that simple things were started here on the planet and then more complex things arose after that. The bacteria are not the only types of prokaryotes on the planet. There are other types. One of them is known as blue-green algae, but that's now an outdated term. A more modern term for blue-green algae is cyanobacteria. So you might have heard of cyanobacteria before. And all that to illustrate that these groups, bacteria and cyanobacteria, are extremely abundant on the planet. They are the hidden organisms that make this world function. For example, cyanobacteria are the only organisms on the planet, or some of the very few organisms on the planet, that can take atmospheric nitrogen gas, which is 2 nitrogens bound together, and can split that bond to free up the nitrogen for making important molecules that we humans and all other life on the planet use. Okay, so these things, we might not see them, but they're very, very important. Okay. Now, prokaryotes, they're very different from the rest of life on the planet in that within their cells, the chromosomes are circular. So it's not a long strand of like a piece of string of DNA. It's more like a rubber band of DNA that it's like looped around on itself. Okay. Another major difference is that there's only 1 chromosome for each prokaryote cell. So it's instead of like having lots of fragments like we have in other organisms. And also prokaryotes like bacteria, they don't have a cell nucleus like we saw in one of the previous pictures. Apparently I can't toggle to the next slide if I got the laser pointer on. Very convenient. Okay, here we go. So this is the type of organism you and I are. We are eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are larger and more complex organisms. Even the single-celled eukaryotes are larger and more complex than bacteria and cyanobacteria. We are different in that our DNA is in linear sections instead of circular sections, and we store our DNA in a cell nucleus, as opposed to the prokaryotes, which have no nucleus. Okay. Now I'm going to explain a little bit more about how these chromosomes are stored, what they do, and yada yada. But I'm going to explain it in the sense of looking at humans, because I figure if you're going to learn about some species, maybe you should learn about humans, since it's a species you're going to spend much of your life with, right? Oh, and you are human, so yeah, it's even more relevant. Okay, so we have 23 different types of chromosomes in each of our cells in our body, we humans. Other species will have different numbers of types of chromosomes, but we humans have 23. And for each of those 23, we have a pair of chromosomes for a grand total of 46 chromosomes in each cell. What you need to know is that for each of the chromosome types, you have 2 versions. One you got from your mom and one you got from your dad. Okay? And each of those types is called a homologous chromosome. So scientists give the chromosomes numbers, that's their names. And so we could talk about, for example, chromosome number 3. You got one copy of chromosome number 3 from your mom and one from your dad, okay? Those two versions of chromosome number 3 are homologous chromosomes. Homo referring to same, okay? They're the same type. Okay, so we humans have 23 types of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes total. Half of our chromosomes and therefore half of our DNA we got from mom and half we got from dad. Now, a new term for you. There's lots of new terms in this presentation. Sorry about that. A new term for you is allele. So remember earlier that I said that genes code for different types of proteins. And when I say code for, that's a way of my saying that genes are a recipe for making a type of protein. Okay, so alleles are different variations of the same gene. So you might have a gene for, I don't know, I'm just going to make something up. Let's say we were unicorns. And let's say we had a gene that was in charge of like making our unicorn horns different colors. This is getting very weird. And there might be one version of that gene that causes the unicorn horns to be blue, and then maybe you have one that makes yours red, etc., etc. So each of those genes that codes for a different unicorn horn color would be an allele. So different forms of the same gene. Okay, enough with that silly example. Let's never go back there again. Now, what I want you to understand is that you've got lots of variation of these alleles in your genes. Maybe mom gave you one version of a gene and your dad gave you a different version of a gene. That could be a problem because you can't or shouldn't have your cells using both recipes to do the same work, right? It would be kind of like if you had from one of your grandmothers a recipe for making pound cake, and from your other grandmother you had a recipe for pound cake. Two different alleles, and they both produce pound cake, right? That's your protein that you're making is the pound cake. But there's different varieties of these recipes. Those are the different alleles. And if you try to do them both at once, you're going to make a mess in the kitchen. It's going to be a disaster. Even if you try to like just fuse the recipes, if you get the ratios of the ingredients wrong because you're using the two different recipes, you're going to wind up with a mess. So for that reason, one of the alleles is always turned off. When you have the two alleles, one from mom, one from dad, one is always turned off. Okay? The one that gets turned off, we refer to as a recessive allele. And the one that gets expressed, meaning that's genetics lingo, expressed as genetics lingo for using a bit of DNA or using an allele or a gene for making a protein. Okay, so the allele that is expressed to make a protein, that is the dominant allele. Okay, so if you have two different alleles, I'm just going to say this one more time. You have two different alleles, two different versions, then the dominant one is the one that gets used to make the protein, and the recessive one just kind of goes quiet. It's not used for anything. Every once in a while, you do run into situations where the two alleles are equally dominant, and you will get a blended trait. That would be going back to the example of the recipes with the pound cakes, that would be like a pound cake that actually works okay when you fuse the two recipes together. We say that for those alleles that they are codominant, as you see here on this last line over here. Okay? All right, let's do like a quick review. We've got DNA. It stores information for how to make amino acids. It does that by the sequence of nucleotides on the molecule. Okay? The cell then takes those amino acids, and with the DNA telling it what to do, it assembles those amino acids into proteins. And then the proteins do all sorts of crazy stuff in the body, and we don't have to worry about that too much. But you should know and remember by now that there are lots of different types of proteins produced by your cells, and there's great diversity of proteins across the plant and animal world, plant and animal kingdom, and so forth and so on. Okay. All right, you get two versions, and only one is expressed, and that's what this slide's all about. Moving on here. Oh, I forgot to warn you, there's naked people in this slide. Don't zoom in, but even if you do, there's nothing to see. All right, let's talk about sexual reproduction here, okay? If each parent sent a full complement of DNA, of their DNA to their offspring, then their offspring would get too much DNA. They would get too many copies of every gene. So what happens in the process of sexual reproduction in organisms on the planet is that those organisms form what are called gametes. Gametes is a fancy word for sperm and egg, which is terms I hope you're familiar with now. If not, go online, look that up, and good luck with what you're going to find. But yeah, you might need some basic sex ed education if you don't understand what sperm and egg are, and I am not paid enough to do that for you here, folks. Assuming then that you understand what sperm and egg are all about, you need to know that they are haploid. Haploid refers to the fact that it's only half of the DNA that you have in your cells that winds up in your gamete. And gamete's just a word for sex cell, meaning sperm or egg. Okay? All the other cells in your body, the ones that are not gametes, those are diploid. That means that they've got all the versions of the DNA from mom and all the versions from your dad. Okay? They got 2 copies of every chromosome type. But haploid cells only have 1 copy of every chromosome type. This is illustrated in this picture here. So we got these 2 humans, one male, one female. They run off in the bushes, and something happens, and sperm and egg get together, and the fusion of sperm and egg forms a zygote, which is a single cell that has all the information to become a full adult. And what happens is now that this zygote, the cell starts dividing and dividing and dividing and forming, and next thing you know, you go from a blob of cells to like a little baby 10 months later, right? Okay, now let's back it up here a little bit. Let's look at the sperm and the egg. You'll notice the cartoonist here has shown that the sperm have 3 chromosomes depicted here, and they are purple, and then the eggs have 3 chromosomes, and they are green. And of course, humans have 23 chromosome types, not 3. But these would come together, and for each of those 3 chromosome types, it has its partner now from either the sperm or the egg, whichever one is different to it. So you got here in the top one, trying to point at the very top one, maybe that one's from, yeah, the top one's from the mom, and that one's from the dad for chromosome number 1. And then it's the 2 versions from chromosome number 2, and so forth and so on. Okay. All right, so the babies form, the zygotes form, eventually grows into a baby matures into adult, and then the adult starts making sex cells, gametes, sperm or egg, depending on its sex. And then those come together to form a new zygote if those individuals choose to reproduce. All right, so the result of this is that offspring are 50% related to each parent. That means you get half of your DNA, half of your chromosomes from your mom, and the other half from your dad. Okay, moving on here. All right. Now there are some species that reproduce asexually, meaning without going through all that elaborate process we just saw. And actually some species that go back and forth. Sometimes they do sexual reproduction, and then in a different situation they switch to asexual. Okay. All you need to know here is that for species that reproduce asexually, meaning without having sex, without forming sperm and egg and all that, when they do that, the offspring are clones of the parents, 100% genetically identical to the parents. They're clones. And one species that does that is the hydra. There's many different species of hydra, so I should have said one life form that does that is the hydra. And hydra just basically grow off a little stem that becomes its own next hydra that will break off and become its own independent, free-living, free-swimming organism. Okay. and that would be a clone. All right, moving on here. Let's answer this question. How does genetic diversity arise and create different alleles and different genes? Okay, so where does all this origin come from? Where does all this genetic diversity come from? Okay. You've maybe heard the term mutation before. It's used in science fiction a lot, like in the X-Men series, like mutations lead to humans with all these different superpowers and stuff like that. Fortunately, it doesn't work like that on Earth. Otherwise, this place would be a mess, right? So in the strictly scientific terms, what is a mutation? It is a change to the DNA. Some of these can be natural, meaning that you can get mutations during the process of cell division that is used to create sperm and egg. That process is called meiosis. So all you need to know here is that during the process of cell division, sometimes there are mistakes in making copies of the DNA and of the chromosomes to pass on to your offspring. You can also get changes to the DNA mutations by being exposed to radiation. Some of that radiation is cosmic radiation, like gamma and X-rays that are sent forth as stars far away go supernova and explode. There's nothing you can do about this radiation. There's no way to block it. If it strikes your DNA at the wrong time in the place, it can cause mutation, and that could potentially lead to a cancer. For example, something you do have more control over is your exposure to solar radiation. That's right, that sun up in the sky, the source of all energy to sustain all life on the planet. It can actually cause genetic mutations, which can be a problem. This is what I'm talking about when you hear about skin cancer. In fact, this cartoon to the right shows you the process of this, where you're exposed to ultraviolet light as part of sunlight, and it can strike the DNA in your skin. It'll change a thymine, which is one of the nucleotides, into an adenine. And then when the DNA in your skin cells uses the DNA, it makes some weird protein that shouldn't be there and shouldn't do what it's doing. Fortunately, we have repair mechanisms that are checking our DNA all the time, but the more sun exposure you have in your life, especially early in your life, the more likely you are to run into problems of skin cancer later on, whether that's precancerous growths or full-blown melanomas and bad stuff like that. So, folks, cover up when you go outside. It's nice to have that tan, but it's also nice to live a long life and not have to battle cancer. All right, mutations, changes to DNA. That's where you get these variations in the DNA that we wind up passing on to offspring. Now, let's start linking all of this to the process of evolution, how there are changes within a species over time and how their species can actually change into other species or give rise to new species over time. We're going to tackle these topics in great detail over the next couple of classes, but I do want to kind of look ahead a little bit here and link these issues about inheritance and mutations to what we're going to be looking at up ahead here, okay? So, for mutations to cause evolutionary change, 3 conditions must be met. First, the mutation needs to arise in a parent's gamete. Otherwise, it's not going to get passed on to the offspring, right? I might go out in the sun and get, mutations from sunlight in my skin cells, but they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be stuck in my skin cells. There needs to be mutation in the gametes. So for women, that means mutations to the eggs in your ovaries. For men, it's mutation to the sperm being produced in your testes. Okay, that's the only time and situation where a parent can produce a mutation that winds up going on to their offspring. Okay. Second condition: the mutation must be heritable. So let's say an offspring, a child, inherits a mutation from their parents. Okay, so that's showing some heritability, but it also has to be passed on to its own offspring. Okay, that's what heritability means. I should have defined that can't assume that you guys know what that means. Heritability means that it can be passed on from one generation to the next within the family line. Okay, so all the genes that you have that you got from your mom and dad, they are heritable genes, and because they've passed on, they've successfully passed on. Okay. Now, the third condition for evolution to happen is that the mutation must give its carrier an advantage in survival, growth, or reproduction. Okay, so for mutation to actually wind up spreading in a population, whoever's got it has to have an advantage over others in the population that don't have that gene. And I know I said gene there when we've been talking about mutations, but when you mutate a gene, you still have a gene. It's just a mutated gene. So here we're talking about the words are kind of synonymous, mutation and gene at the same time. Okay, so let's roll through these three again. Okay, so we're talking about evolutionary change when the offspring's generation is different from the parental generation. Okay, so for example, if my daughters I have two daughters, if they have some new mutation, something new that's in their DNA that neither me nor my wife has, that would be an example of evolutionary change. Okay, now to have evolutionary change affect a whole population at that scale, these three conditions must be met. The mutations must arise in the gametes and therefore be passed on. It must be heritable, so it gets passed on from generation to generation to generation. Therefore, it's spreading through the population, and it's spreading because of point 3. That mutation gives anybody that has it an advantage in survival, growth, or reproduction. These are the foundations for what is known as microevolution, highlighted in yellow here at the bottom. If those conditions are met, a gene can spread through a population, and when it does, it's known as, that form of evolution is known as microevolution. In a couple of classes, we'll talk about macroevolution, which is how new species arise from existing species. Okay, so here's a question for you to think about. Normally, I'd send this out to you in class time to breakout groups and come up with answers, but we'll do different questions for our breakout groups. So what do you think? Are new beneficial mutations frequent, occasional, or rare? So we're talking about mutations, going back a slide here, okay? Are changes to the DNA, are they, for the ones that are beneficial as opposed to those that would cause problems, are they frequent, occasional, or rare? How often do you think they happen? Now, because often is kind of a vague term and all that, I've given you some parameters. Are they frequent, like you get a new gene per generation? In other words, if you happen to reproduce in your life, you're going to pass on at least one new gene via mutation to your offspring. Or are they occasional, like it's only every 10 generations? Or are they rare, like only after many generations? And remember, these are mutations that cause benefits, so they wind up ultimately spreading through the population. Okay, so think to yourself, maybe pause here and think it out for yourself, and then pick up in just a second to find out what the answer is. Okay, welcome back. Let's find out what's going on. So these were your choices. This is how most students respond. They're like, not sure. Let me guess the one in the middle. So they went with occasional. And in fact, this would not be the best choice. In fact, the answer is that new mutations that are beneficial are exceedingly rare. It's only about 1 per every 1,000 generations, or 1 per every 1,000 mutations are going to be beneficial. And the mutations themselves tend to be pretty rare too. So all this to say that new beneficial mutations arise very rarely in populations. Evolution is generally a slow process as a result. It takes a long time for there to be a new trait to arise, a new gene to arise that confers an advantage and then spreads through the population. And so that's why when we talk about evolutionary time, we're usually looking at organisms changing over very long periods of time, like thousands of years to millions of years. as opposed to like just changing from day to day or generation to generation. Okay. All right. Now, let's put this in some more perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the mutations have to affect the sex cells for them to have cause evolutionary change in a population. A mutation somewhere else is not going to have any impact. Now, another point to make here is that mutations arise randomly. That means that they arise unpredictably, and whether they're good, bad, or what have you, the organism has no choice in that. There's no way you control like what radiation strikes your DNA and where it strikes your DNA and what changes it causes. We do not have the capacity just in and of ourselves to control that. If we did, then we could always be improving our offspring, and life on the planet would again be like really crazy because everybody be evolving like from generation to the next generation. There wouldn't be a lot of similarity across. There wouldn't be populations anymore. Everybody's sort of split off into new species every time there's a reproductive event. Okay, so mutations are quite rare that cause these benefits. Let's see what else. Most mutations are either neutral, meaning they don't really have any noticeable effect. They might cause like a little change in some biochemistry in your body, but it's like nothing that really affects anything badly. So those would be neutral mutations. Some mutations, most mutations are going to be causing problems, right? Because if you take a very complicated recipe for making something complex like a human or a dog or a weed or a fly or something like that, you mess with with the DNA, the instructions for doing that. If you just mess with it at random and go just like, flipping things on and off and changing things, you're going to mess stuff up. And so a lot of times mutations lead to problems. And so a lot of zygotes, which is, remember, sperm and egg come together to form a zygote. A lot of zygotes never make it to maturity because there's a mutation in there, and the mother's body like automatically aborts that. And so it's let's see, what else do I want to make there? It's only quite rare that you wind up getting a beneficial mutation being passed on. Okay, and I have this illustration of somebody with or a picture of somebody with polydactyly to illustrate how when you go tweaking the DNA, you can lead to issues that can be complicated. So people that have polydactyly like this have a harder time with some aspects of life, like walking and things like that. Maybe there's an advantage to that in some situations. I don't know. But these kinds of problems are generally not going to help them survive and to grow, to survive and reproduce. So this would be an example generally considered as a negative mutation, one that's not helpful. Okay. All right, moving on here. So microevolution, which we covered way back here, is the change in the genetics of a population through time. And microevolution in some groups of organisms is really fast, and that includes bacteria. Bacteria have evolved resistance to our drugs that we designed to kill bacteria. There's a whole process there where you wind up having doctors prescribing too many antibiotics. People don't take their antibiotics properly, and therefore they cause some of the bacteria in their bodies to actually become immune to the drug through the process of natural selection, which we'll talk about in the next class. There's lots of examples of bacteria doing this. Weeds have done this, with any herbicide that comes out. Wait a few years and there'll be some weeds that have evolved resistance to those herbicides, and then you have a whole new problem for your farmers and agriculturalists. We see a lot of examples of that. We've seen a lot of, in the third example here, a lot of pest species, insect pests that have evolved resistance to insecticides. All this to say that even though beneficial mutations are rare, you've got some species out there that are reproducing quickly and reproducing often, and that increases their chances of having one of those beneficial mutations in a time frame that humans can observe. And so we see that in some of these populations. And that of course messes our systems of antibiotics to keep people healthy, or in agricultural systems when we're relying on herbicides and insecticides to kill off things that eat our crops. Okay. All right, so we're about to wrap this up here. We're going to study in the next unit is the different types of microevolutionary change. There are several. We're going to learn about Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and the history of the idea of natural selection, which is one of those types of microevolutionary change. And then after that, we're going to take a class to look at how microevolutionary changes, little tiny changes, leads to the formation of new species over long periods of time. Okay, so that's what's up next. For this class, we don't have a section in our textbook that talks about inheritance, but we do have a video that I posted from a website called Crash Course, and good old Hank is going to give you a very good introduction to some of these same topics that I talked about, but probably in a different context, so that might make sense for you if things did not make sense here. If any of this stuff is confusing and you want more information, you can look online. This is simple basic biology. Maybe not simple, but it's basic biology, or just reach out to me and I'll be happy to meet with you and talk with you, or just email with you if you like, in order to explain things a little bit differently. All right, that's a wrap, folks. See ya in class.